"Show me your receipt, or you're not leaving." The words didn't come loud, but they landed heavy enough to still the room like someone had turned down the volume on everything at once. And for a second, all you could hear was the faint hum of the neon sign outside and the soft clink of a spoon settling against porcelain, as if even it had decided to stop mid-motion. Naomi Carter didn't move, not right away. Her fingers still wrapped loosely around a ceramic mug that had long gone cold, a thin ring of coffee tracing the inside like a quiet reminder of time she didn't have. 12 hours on her feet, another shift behind her, scrubs still creased at the shoulders, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to her skin, as if the hospital hadn't fully let her go yet. She looked up slowly, not startled, not even surprised, just tired in a way that settled behind her eyes, the kind that didn't ask for sympathy, only space. But space was the one thing she wasn't being given. Across from her stood Officer Ryan Blake, posture straight. Uniform pressed so sharply it caught the overhead light in clean lines, his hand resting just a little too comfortably on his belt like he had all the time in the world, like this moment belonged to him. "I already paid," Naomi said, her voice steady, not raised, not defensive, just clear, the kind of clear that doesn't try to prove anything, but doesn't bend either. A couple of booths down, someone shifted in their seat, leather creaking under the weight of discomfort. A man in a baseball cap glanced up then back down at his plate like eye contact might pull him into something he didn't want to be part of. The waitress behind the counter paused mid-wipe, rags suspended over chrome as her eyes flickered between them, unsure where to land. Officer Blake tilted his head slightly, not enough to seem dramatic, just enough to signal disbelief. Or maybe something else, something quieter, colder. "Then show me the receipt," he said, not asking, not suggesting, just placing the words down like they were already decided. Naomi's grip on the mug tightened just a fraction, barely visible unless you were looking for it, her thumb brushing along the chipped edge as if grounding herself in something small and real. "I left it on the table when I paid," she replied, her gaze holding his now, not challenging, but not dropping either. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing softly against wet pavement. The world moving on like nothing inside mattered. But inside, everything had narrowed to this one moment, this one table, this one line that had already been crossed even if no one had said it out loud. "Officer." Blake exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, like patience was something he practiced or performed. "Convenient." He muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear. And that's when it shifted, not the volume, not the posture, but the air itself. The way it pressed a little heavier against the chest, the way a simple word could carry something more than it claimed. Naomi felt it, not as a shock, but as something familiar, something she had learned to recognize without needing it explained. She set the mug down carefully, the base meeting the table with a soft, deliberate sound. "I'm not trying to leave without paying," she said, each word measured, each breath controlled, like she had said versions of this before in rooms that didn't listen any better than this one. Behind her, a young girl sat with her mother, eyes wide, watching in that open, unfiltered way children do before they learn to look away. Naomi noticed, just for a second, and something in her expression softened. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet steadiness, like she understood she wasn't the only one in the room learning something right now. Officer Blake's jaw tightened, subtle, but there, his fingers shifting slightly on his belt as if the moment needed anchoring. "Ma'am," he said, the word formal but the tone anything but. People don't just forget receipts when they've paid. Naomi didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she didn't rush to fill silence the way others did. She let it sit, let it breathe, her eyes moving briefly to the counter, to the register, to the small slip of paper that might still be there or might not, and then back to him. "Sometimes people don't get looked at when they pay," she said quietly, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it landed differently, like something that had weight because it didn't try to. The waitress swallowed, shifting her stance, her rag finally lowering to the counter, but she didn't speak. Not yet. The man in the baseball cap froze mid-bite, fork hovering inches from his mouth, unsure whether to keep going or stop completely. Officer Blake's eyes narrowed just slightly, the kind of narrowing that comes when a narrative doesn't go the way it's expected to. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" he asked. And now there was something sharper underneath, not raised volume, but raised stakes. Naomi inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again. I'm telling you the truth, she said. And for a moment, just a brief flicker, something in the room hesitated. Like the truth itself had stepped in and no one quite knew what to do with it. But hesitation doesn't last long. In places like this, not when someone believes they're in control, Officer Blake took a small step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to close the distance, just enough to make it clear that whatever this was, it wasn't over, and Naomi didn't move back, didn't shift in her seat, didn't look away. She just sat there, hands resting now on the table, palms down, steady, present, like she had already decided something long before he walked in, and whatever came next wasn't going to change that. Officer Blake's step forward did not make a sound, but it shifted something all the same. The distance between authority and accusation closing into something tighter, something harder to ignore. Naomi could feel it in the way the air seemed to press closer around her shoulders, in the way the quiet in the diner was no longer passive but watchful, like every breath in the room had slowed just enough to notice what would happen next. She kept her hands where they were, flat against the table. Fingers relaxed, not clenched, not defensive, just present, her pulse steady in her wrists. A rhythm she focused on the way she had learned to do during long nights at the hospital when alarms sounded and decisions had to be made without panic. Truth does not clear you without proof, Officer Blake said, his voice still measured. But now there was a faint edge beneath it, not loud enough to call out, but sharp enough to feel. Naomi lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement, like she had heard this kind of line before in different words, different rooms, same meaning. And assumptions do not make me guilty, she replied, just as evenly. The exchange hung there for a moment, suspended, neither rising nor falling, just existing in that narrow space between two people who refused to yield to tone alone. Behind the counter, the waitress shifted her weight again, this time setting the rag down completely, her eyes darting to the register, then back to Naomi, then to the officer, caught in that quiet tension of knowing something might be wrong, but not knowing how much it would cost to say it. A man at the end of the counter cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable, like a reminder that the room was still alive, still listening. Naomi noticed the movement without turning her head, her awareness expanding just enough to take in the edges of the moment without losing focus on the center. Officer Blake followed her gaze for a fraction of a second, then brought it back to her. Let me make this simple, he said, his tone flattening now, procedural, controlled. Either you provide proof of payment, or we resolve this another way. The phrasing was careful, almost neutral, but the implication beneath it was not. Naomi inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting just a fraction before settling again. She glanced down at the table, at the faint circle left by her coffee mug, at the small scratches in the laminate surface, details that grounded her in something real, something unchanging. Then she looked back up. I already told you what happened, she said, her voice softer now, not weaker, just quieter, like she did not need volume to hold her place. A faint flicker crossed Officer Blake's face. Irritation maybe, or something closer to impatience, the kind that comes when a situation refuses to follow a script. He reached toward the edge of the table, not touching her, not yet, but close enough that the intent was clear. Ma'am, I am trying to give you an opportunity to cooperate, he said, and there it was, that subtle shift from inquiry to control, the line that moved things from conversation into something else entirely. Naomi's eyes dropped briefly to his hand, then lifted again to meet his gaze, steady, unflinching. I am cooperating, she said, and for a moment, just a brief one, there was a crack in the rhythm, like the words had not landed where he expected them to. The young girl at the booth leaned forward slightly, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not pulling her back, just holding her there, as if unsure whether to shield her or let her see. The waitress took a step toward the register now, slow, hesitant, her fingers hovering over the buttons as if trying to recall something, a transaction, a moment, anything that might settle this without forcing her into the center of it. Did you ring her up? The man at the counter asked quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, just letting the question exist in the space. The waitress hesitated, her lips parting slightly before closing again, her eyes flickering to Officer Blake, then back to the screen. The silence stretched tighter now, thinner, like it might snap if pulled any further. Naomi felt it too, the weight of it, the way every second that passed without resolution made the moment heavier, more defined. She shifted her hands slightly, not to pull away, but to rest them more comfortably, her palms still open against the table, a quiet signal that she was not hiding anything, not bracing, just waiting. Officer Blake straightened a fraction, his posture adjusting as if recalibrating. "This is not complicated," he said, though his voice carried less certainty now than before. "You paid, you show proof, and you walk out." Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but something deeper settled behind her eyes, something firm, something rooted. "And if I cannot show you something that should not be required for me to be believed," she said, her voice still calm, still controlled, "then what does that say about what you already decided?" The words did not come fast, they did not rush, they arrived one at a time, deliberate, and they did not accuse so much as reveal. The room seemed to hold its breath again, not out of fear, but out of recognition, like something unspoken had finally been given shape. Officer Blake's jaw tightened again, more visible now, his hand retracting slightly from the table, not retreating, just pausing. And for the first time since he had spoken, there was a moment where he did not immediately respond. A small, almost imperceptible gap where control did not flow as smoothly as before. And in that gap, Naomi remained exactly where she was, unchanged, unshaken, her presence quiet but immovable, like a line drawn not with force, but with certainty, a line that did not need to be raised to be seen. The pause did not last long, but it was long enough to be noticed, long enough for the room to shift its weight again as if everyone felt it at the same time. That small fracture in certainty. Officer Blake inhaled once, steadying himself, his shoulders tightening just slightly before settling back into that practiced posture. "What I decide is based on what I see," he said, his tone regaining structure. Though something underneath it had changed, something less fluid than before, Naomi did not interrupt, did not rush to respond. She simply watched him, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in the way she held his gaze, like she understood the difference between control and truth, and how often they were mistaken for each other. Behind the counter, the waitress finally pressed a button on the register, the screen flickering faintly, casting a soft glow across her face as she leaned in, scanning the recent orders, her lips moving silently as if retracing steps she should have remembered without effort. "I remember her," she said suddenly, her voice low but clear enough to reach across the room. The words landed gently, not forceful, but undeniable. Naomi's eyes shifted toward her for a brief second, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging. Officer Blake turned his head slightly, his attention redirecting. "You rang her up?" he asked, and there was a subtle difference now, not quite doubt, but not full confidence either. The waitress hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen again. "I think so," she said, then quickly added, "She paid cash." The word cash lingered, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried its own set of assumptions. Officer Blake's jaw set again, the line of it sharper now. "Think is not the same as know," he replied, his voice firm, reclaiming ground. The waitress swallowed, nodding slightly. "I know she was here. I know she ordered coffee and eggs. I remember because she said thank you before she left the counter," she said, her voice gaining a little strength as she spoke, like memory itself was giving her something to hold on to. Naomi remained still, her hands resting on the table, her breathing even, not leaning into the support, not drawing attention to it, just letting it exist. The man at the counter shifted again, setting his fork down this time. "That sounds like a paying customer to me," he muttered, not loudly, but not quietly either, just enough to place the thought into the space where it could not be ignored. Officer Blake's eyes flickered toward him for a brief second, then back to Naomi. The room was no longer silent in the same way. It was not frozen. It was alive with small movements, subtle shifts. People no longer entirely willing to remain invisible, and that changed the shape of everything, even if no one said it directly. Naomi felt it, not as validation, but as a change in balance, a slight tilt that did not erase what had already happened but made it harder to pretend it had not. Officer Blake exhaled again, slower this time, his hand moving away from the edge of the table completely now, returning to his side, not in surrender, but in recalibration. Without a receipt, there is no proof, he said, though the words carried less weight now, like they had already begun to thin out under pressure. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her gaze steady. Sometimes proof is not paper, she said, her voice still calm, still measured. Sometimes it is people. Paying attention, the words did not rise, did not push. They settled into the room like something that had always been there, but had not been named until now. The young girl at the booth leaned even closer, her eyes fixed on Naomi, her mother's hand still resting lightly on her shoulder, but not pulling her back. Not anymore. The waitress stepped fully away from the register now, her shoulders straightening just a little, like she had crossed an invisible line herself. I remember her paying, she said again, firmer this time, the repetition giving it weight, giving it presence. Officer Blake looked at her, really looked this time, as if trying to measure the cost of believing versus continuing. And for a moment, that same small gap returned, that space where certainty did not immediately fill in. Naomi did not move, did not speak. She simply remained, her stillness no longer just endurance, but something more defined, something that held its ground without needing to push outward. The room breathed again, softly, collectively, like something had shifted just enough to be felt, but not yet resolved, not yet finished. And in that suspended moment, everything waited, not for noise, not for force, but for the next decision, the next line that would either hold or break. The air did not snap, but it tightened, like a thread pulled just enough to remind everyone it could break. Officer Blake's eyes moved between the waitress and Naomi again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if recalculating something that no longer fit as cleanly as before. His stance remained firm, but there was a slight shift in his shoulders, a fraction lower, a fraction less certain. You are telling me you remember a cash transaction with no receipt, he said, directing the words toward the waitress, but keeping Naomi in his peripheral vision. The waitress nodded, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. Yes, sir, I do, she replied, her voice steady now, not loud, not confrontational, just present, the kind of presence that had not been there moments ago, the kind that came when silence was no longer enough. Naomi watched without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, but inside, something had settled deeper, not relief, not victory, just a quiet confirmation that she had not imagined the moment the way it had unfolded. The man at the counter leaned back slightly on his stool, arms folding across his chest, no longer pretending to be absorbed in his meal, his gaze now fixed openly on the exchange. Like the invisible line that kept people out of situations had been erased just enough to let him step closer without moving at all. Officer Blake exhaled slowly, his gaze returning fully to Naomi. Even if that is the case, he said, choosing his words more carefully now. Without documentation, this becomes a matter of conflicting statements. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady. It was not conflicting until you decided it was, she said, her voice calm, not sharp, but precise, like she was placing each word exactly where it needed to land. The statement did not rise in volume, but it carried the kind of weight that came from not needing to prove itself. The young girl at the booth shifted again, her small fingers now resting flat on the table, mirroring Naomi without realizing it. Her mother glanced at her, then back at Naomi, something in her expression softening, not fully stepping in, but no longer pulling away either. The waitress took another step forward, closer to the edge of the counter. Sir, I can check the drawer, she offered, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. The total would match if she paid. Officer Blake's eyes flickered toward the register again, then back to Naomi. The suggestion hung there, a practical solution, simple on the surface, but heavier underneath, because it required a shift, a willingness to move from assumption into verification. And that shift was not always easy, especially when control had already been claimed. Naomi remained still, her hands resting where they had been, her presence unchanged, but her eyes followed the exchange. With a quiet attentiveness, like she was watching something unfold that she had seen before in different forms, Officer Blake hesitated, just for a second, then gave a small nod. "Do it," he said, the word. Short, contained, but it carried a different tone than before, less directive, more measured. The waitress moved quickly now, her fingers pressing buttons with more certainty, the register drawer sliding open with a soft metallic sound that echoed just enough in the quiet room. She began counting, her lips moving silently as bills passed through her hands, each second stretching, each movement drawing the room tighter into the moment. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly to the table again, to the faint reflection of the overhead light on the surface, then lifted back up, her focus steady, not anticipating, not assuming, just present. Officer Blake watched the count, his jaw set, his posture still controlled, but the earlier ease was gone, replaced by something more rigid, more aware. The man at the counter leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the surface now, fully invested. The young girl's eyes widened just a little more, her attention fixed on the drawer, as if the answer might reveal something bigger than just a payment. The waitress finished counting, her hands pausing for a brief moment before she looked up, her eyes meeting Officer Blake's first, then shifting to Naomi. "It matches," she said, her voice clear, the words simple, but they landed with a quiet finality that filled the space more than any raised voice could have. The room did not erupt. It did not react loudly, but something changed, something subtle and undeniable, like a tension that had been held too long, finally releasing just enough to be felt. Naomi did not move, did not smile, did not shift in her seat. She simply remained as she was, her hands still resting on the table, her gaze calm, her presence steady, as if the confirmation had not altered her position because she had never left it. Officer Blake stood there for a moment, the silence settling around him differently now, not as something he controlled, but as something he had to stand within, his eyes flickering once more between the register and Naomi. And in that brief pause, the balance of the room had already shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that it could not be undone. The words "it matches" did not echo, but they settled, heavy and undeniable, like something placed carefully in the center of the room where no one could pretend not to see it. And for a moment, no one spoke, not the man at the counter, not the waitress, not even the quiet hum of the neon sign seemed to dare interrupt what had just been confirmed. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her hands still resting on the table, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not fixed on Officer Blake, not fixed on anyone, just present, as if the truth did not require her to move toward it because it had already been where she stood all along. Officer Blake shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement, but one that carried more than it appeared, his shoulders adjusting as if the uniform itself had become heavier, his eyes flicking once more to the open register, then back to Naomi. And this time, there was no immediate response, no quick reclaiming of control, just a pause that stretched long enough to feel different, not uncertain, but no longer absolute. The waitress slowly closed the register drawer, the soft click of metal sliding into place marking the end of something that had been questioned but now stood confirmed. She stepped back slightly, her hands lowering to her sides, her breathing visible in the small rise and fall of her shoulders, as if she had crossed a line she had not expected to step over when the night began. The man at the counter let out a quiet exhale, almost a sigh, not dramatic, just a release of something that had been held without permission. "Guess that settles it," he said under his breath, not directing it at anyone in particular, but the words carried, threading through the silence like a simple conclusion that did not need embellishment. The young girl's fingers loosened their grip on the table, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, though her eyes remained fixed on Naomi, as if waiting to see what came next, as if understanding that resolution did not always look the way stories promised. Officer Blake finally straightened fully, his posture returning to something structured, something official, but it was not the same as before. The edges were still there, but the center had shifted. "All right," he said, the words measured, controlled, but lacking the earlier certainty that had driven them. "It appears the payment was made." He did not say he was wrong, He did not say anything that would step outside the boundaries he had built around himself. But the acknowledgement was there, contained within the phrasing, limited but present. Naomi lifted her gaze fully to him now, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged. She did not nod, did not respond immediately. She simply held the moment, allowing it to exist without rushing to fill it. Because some moments did not need to be completed with words, they needed to be seen for what they were. Officer Blake adjusted his stance again, his hand moving briefly along the edge of his belt. A habitual motion, something practiced, something to anchor himself back into familiarity. "You are free to go," he added, the sentence delivered with formality, but without the authority it had carried before, as if the structure remained but the foundation beneath it had shifted just enough to be felt. Naomi's fingers moved slightly on the table, a small motion, almost imperceptible, as if reconnecting with the present after standing still for so long. She glanced down for a brief second, then back up. Her voice when it came was quiet, steady. "I was always free to go," she said, not as a challenge, not as a correction, but as a statement that did not need to rise in order to be understood. The words did not push against him. They simply existed alongside what had already happened, and in that space, they carried more weight than anything louder could have. The room absorbed it, not with reaction, not with sound, but with a kind of stillness that felt different now, less tense, more aware. The waitress looked at Naomi, her expression softening slightly, not smiling, but something close to it, something that acknowledged what had been seen and what had been proven. The man at the counter picked up his fork again, but he did not immediately return to his meal, his eyes lingering for just a second longer, as if committing the moment to memory before letting it pass. Officer Blake did not respond to Naomi's words. Not directly. His gaze held hers for a brief moment, then shifted away, not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to break the line that had been held for too long. He took a small step back, creating space where there had been none, and in that movement, something unspoken was acknowledged, not undone, not erased, but recognized. Naomi slowly lifted her hands from the table, the faint outline of where they had rested remaining for just a second before fading. She reached for her mug, then paused, leaving it where it was, the coffee long gone cold, no longer needed. She pushed her chair back gently, the legs scraping softly against the floor, the sound light, almost quiet compared to everything that had filled the room before. She stood, her posture straight, her shoulders relaxed, not carrying the weight of the moment with her, but not pretending it had not existed either. And for a second, just a brief one, the room watched her, not as someone under scrutiny, but as someone who had remained, who had held her place without raising her voice, without stepping outside herself. And that changed something. Even if no one said it out loud, even if it would fade by morning, even if it would not. She turned slightly toward the door, the faint glow of the streetlights visible through the glass. The world outside still moving, still unaware, still unchanged in all the ways that mattered and all the ways that did not. And behind her, the silence no longer felt like pressure. It felt like something that had been opened, just enough to let something real pass through. Naomi did not rush toward the door, even though it was only a few steps away. Even though the night outside waited without questions, her hand rested lightly against the back of the chair for just a second longer than necessary. As if grounding herself in the space she had just stood her ground in, not claiming it, not owning it, just acknowledging that it had happened, that it had been real, behind her. The quiet in the diner did not return to what it had been before. It shifted into something softer, something more aware, the kind of quiet that follows after something has been seen clearly for the first time. The waitress moved from behind the counter, her steps careful but intentional, stopping just a few feet from Naomi. "Ma'am," she said, her voice lower now, almost tentative, but sincere. Naomi turned slightly, not fully, just enough to face her without stepping away from the door. "I am sorry," the waitress added, the words simple, unpolished, but honest in a way that did not try to fix anything, just to recognize it. Naomi held her gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softened just a fraction, not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, just in acknowledgement. "You remembered," she said quietly, and the waitress nodded, her shoulders easing just a little, as if the recognition mattered more than the apology itself. The man at the counter shifted again, his voice coming a little louder this time. Not confrontational, just present. Took a minute, but it got there, he said, half to himself, half to the room. Naomi did not respond to him, but the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, not quite anything that needed to be named. Officer Blake remained where he stood, a step back from where he had been before, his posture still upright, still structured, but no longer at the center of the room in the same way. His eyes followed Naomi as she turned back toward the door, and for a brief moment, there was something there, something unspoken, not quite apology, not quite reflection, but something closer to awareness than before. Naomi reached for the door handle, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal, the faint chill grounding her again in the present. The glass reflected a faint outline of her face, tired but steady, the kind of steadiness that did not come from winning, but from not stepping away from who you were when it mattered. She pushed the door open slowly, the soft chime above it ringing once, light and clear, cutting through the lingering quiet like a small signal that something had ended, or maybe just shifted. The air outside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed earlier, the streetlights casting long reflections across the damp pavement. The world beyond the diner unchanged, cars passing, distant traffic humming, people moving without knowing what had just taken place inside. Naomi stepped out, the door closing gently behind her, the sound soft, final, but not heavy. Inside, the room seemed to exhale again, the tension that had been held for too long releasing in small, quiet ways. The waitress returned to the counter, her movements slower now, more thoughtful, like she was replaying the moment in her mind, not to justify it, but to understand it. The man at the counter picked up his fork again, but his gaze lingered on the door for a second longer before he looked down, as if the scene had left something behind that he was not ready to let go of just yet. Officer Blake remained still for a moment after the door closed, his hand resting loosely at his side, his eyes fixed on the spot where Naomi had been standing, the absence of her presence noticeable in a way that surprised him. He shifted his weight slightly, his posture adjusting again, but this time it was not about reclaiming control. It was about standing in what had just happened without moving away from it too quickly. He glanced toward the register, toward the waitress, toward the small details that had confirmed something he had not been willing to see at first, and for a brief second, the room did not feel like something he could direct. It felt like something he had stepped into and altered, whether he meant to or not. Outside, Naomi walked along the sidewalk, her steps steady, not hurried, not slowed, just even, her breath visible in the cool night air as she exhaled, the rhythm of her footsteps matching the quiet hum of the street. She did not look back at the diner, did not turn to see if anyone was watching. She carried the moment with her, not as weight, but as something settled, something that had been faced and held without breaking. A car passed by slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating her face before moving on, leaving her in the softer glow of the streetlights again. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the small folded bill she had left earlier, a habit she had formed long ago, always keeping just enough on hand, always making sure things were accounted for, always prepared for moments that asked more than they should. She let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, not relief, just a release of something that did not need to be carried forward. Behind her, inside the diner, the night continued, orders placed, coffee poured, conversations slowly returning, but not quite the same as before, because something had shifted, something small but real, something that would linger in the space long after the door had closed and the sound of her footsteps had faded into the rhythm of the city. The night air carried a quiet chill, the kind that settled into the edges of your skin without asking permission. Naomi walked steadily beneath the glow of streetlights, her footsteps soft against the damp concrete. Each step measured, not rushed, not lingering, just forward, always forward. The hum of distant traffic filled the spaces between her breaths, a steady rhythm that reminded her the world had not paused, not even for a moment like the one she had just left behind. She reached the corner and slowed slightly, the red hand of the crosswalk blinking steadily across the street, counting down seconds no one ever really watched. Her reflection caught briefly in the glass of a closed storefront. the faint outline of her face framed by exhaustion and something else, something quieter, something steadier. She did not stop to study it, just acknowledged it, and kept moving. Behind her, the diner door opened again, the small bell chiming softly into the night. Footsteps followed, slower, more deliberate. Naomi did not turn immediately. She heard the sound, registered it, but kept walking, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, as if whatever came next would meet her on her terms, not the other way around. Naomi. The voice called, not loud, not urgent, but familiar enough to reach her without force. She paused then, just for a second, her breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the sidewalk behind her, and there he was, Ethan Carter, standing just outside the diner, the warm light from inside casting a soft outline around him, his coat slightly open, his posture composed but not rigid, his gaze fixed on her with a calm that did not rush, did not demand, just met her where she stood. Naomi exhaled quietly, a small release she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. "You are late," she said, her voice soft, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating something that existed between them without tension. Ethan stepped closer, his shoes making a faint sound against the pavement, each step unhurried. "Intentional. Traffic," he replied simply, his tone even, but his eyes searched her face more carefully now, taking in the details she had not yet spoken, the slight tightness around her eyes, the way her hands rested at her sides, steady but not entirely at ease. He stopped a few feet in front of her, not closing the distance completely, giving her space that felt deliberate, respectful, like he understood the difference between presence and intrusion. "You all right?" he asked, not as a reflex, not as a casual question, but as something that carried weight. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, the question settling between them. She did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because the answer was not simple, not something that could be reduced to a single word without losing what it meant. She glanced briefly back toward the diner, the light inside still warm, still ordinary, as if nothing had happened at all. Then she looked back at him. "I handled it," she said, her voice steady. And that was the truth, not the whole truth, but the part that mattered most. Ethan nodded slowly, not pressing further, not asking for details she had not offered. His eyes shifted past her for a moment, toward the diner door, as if sensing the weight of what had taken place without needing it explained. The door opened again, the faint chime carrying into the night once more. Officer Blake stepped out this time, his figure framed by the same warm light that had outlined Ethan moments ago, but it felt different now, less controlled, less certain. He paused just outside, his gaze landing first on Naomi, then moving to Ethan, taking in the scene in a single glance, something in his posture shifted, subtle but visible, like recognition had arrived before introduction. Ethan turned slightly, his attention now including the man behind Naomi. His expression did not harden, did not change dramatically. It remained composed, but there was a quiet alertness in the way he stood, a stillness that suggested he was fully present now, not just arriving. Officer Blake took a small step forward, his hands resting at his sides, no longer positioned with the earlier confidence. "Ma'am," he began, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying something different beneath it now, something closer to caution than authority. Naomi did not turn back toward him immediately. Her eyes remained on Ethan for a brief second longer, as if grounding herself in something familiar before facing what followed. Then she shifted her gaze, her posture unchanged. "Yes," she replied, her tone calm, neither inviting nor dismissing, just acknowledging. Officer Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second, the pause small but noticeable, his eyes flicking briefly to Ethan again, as if assessing something he could not yet name. "I wanted to clarify that there was a misunderstanding inside," he said, the words carefully chosen, structured in a way that maintained form while adjusting meaning. Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, but her eyes steady, the kind of steady that did not need confirmation to exist. Ethan's gaze moved between them, quiet, observant, his presence now part of the moment without overtaking it. Officer Blake continued. "The situation has been resolved," he added, and the phrasing lingered, formal, contained, but no longer fully in control of the narrative it described. Naomi inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement, not agreement, not rejection, just recognition that the words had been spoken. The streetlight above flickered faintly, casting a brief shift in shadow across all three of them, and in that moment, the space between them held more than just conversation. It held what had happened, what had been seen, and what could not be undone, even in the quiet of a night that continued moving forward. The word resolve did not sit easily in the air. It lingered like something placed too quickly over a crack that had not been sealed. Naomi heard it, registered it, but did not move toward it. Her gaze remained steady, not on the word, not even fully on the man who said it, but on the space between them where the truth of what had happened still existed, unedited, unchanged. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting his stance so that he was fully aligned with her. Not in front, not behind, but present in a way that did not take over the moment. His eyes rested on Officer Blake now, calm, observant, the kind of calm that did not come from ignorance, but from understanding when to speak and when not to. The streetlight above hummed faintly, a low electrical sound that filled the silence without breaking it. Officer Blake cleared his throat softly, the movement small but noticeable, as if the quiet required him to fill it with something more structured. There was a miscommunication, he added, his tone still measured, still controlled, but the edges of it no longer carried the same certainty as before. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in recognition of the phrasing. Miscommunication, she repeated, her voice soft, almost reflective, as if testing the word for what it actually held. She let it sit there for a moment, not rejecting it, not accepting it, just allowing it to exist. Ethan's gaze moved briefly to her, then back to Officer Blake, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture suggested a shift, a readiness that had not been there when he first arrived. Officer Blake's eyes flickered between them again, lingering a fraction longer on Ethan this time, as if trying to place him, to understand something that had not been part of the earlier equation. Yes, he said, a little more firmly now, as if reinforcing the narrative he had chosen. The situation has been addressed and clarified. Naomi's shoulders rose slightly with a quiet breath, then settled again, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She took a small step forward, not toward him, but simply shifting her weight into a more grounded stance. It was clear, she said, her voice steady, not raised, not sharpened, just precise. It just was not believed. The words landed softly, but they did not disperse. They held their shape, the kind of shape that could not be smoothed over with phrasing. The street around them remained quiet. A car passed slowly at the far end of the block, its headlights casting a brief sweep of light across their faces before moving on, leaving them in the steady glow of the street lamp again. Officer Blake inhaled, the movement visible in the rise of his chest, his gaze shifting downward for a brief second before returning to Naomi. And in that moment, something flickered, something closer to acknowledgement than before, though it did not fully settle into words. Ethan took a step forward then, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to close the distance slightly, his presence now more defined within the space. "Officer," he said, his voice even, calm, but carrying a quiet authority that did not rely on volume. Blake's attention moved to him fully now, the shift immediate, as if the introduction had been waiting to happen even before the word was spoken. "Yes, sir," Blake replied, the response automatic, but the tone slightly different, less certain of its footing. Ethan's gaze held his, steady, not confrontational, but not yielding either. "You said it was resolved," he continued, his words measured, each one placed carefully. "I would like to understand what that means from your perspective." The question was simple, but it opened something, a space that required more than a surface answer. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering again, the structure of his earlier statements now meeting something that asked for more clarity than they were built to provide. "It means there is no further issue," Blake said, the response controlled, but lacking the ease it might have had before. Naomi remained still beside Ethan, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, not stepping into the exchange, not stepping away from it. just holding her place within it. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if considering the response. Then, his eyes shifted briefly toward the diner behind Blake, then back again. "And what was the issue?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but the question itself carrying weight. Blake hesitated, the pause longer this time, more visible, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for a way to answer without undoing what he had already said. "There was a concern regarding payment," he replied, carefully, choosing each word as if it might be examined later. Naomi's gaze did not move, but something in her expression settled further, something quiet but firm, like a line that had already been drawn and did not need to be redrawn. Ethan watched Blake for a moment, then gave a small nod. "And that concern was incorrect," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Blake's lips pressed together briefly, then parted. "Yes," he admitted, the word quiet, contained, but unmistakable. The air shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be felt, enough to change the shape of the moment. Once more, Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath steady, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction more, not because something had been won, but because something had been named clearly, without avoidance, without adjustment. The streetlight flickered again, then steadied, casting the same quiet glow over all three of them. But the space between them no longer felt the same as it had moments ago, because something real had been spoken into it, and that changed everything, even if nothing else had moved. The word "yes" did not echo, but it stayed, suspended in the space between them like something that could not be taken back once it had been given shape. Naomi heard it, not as confirmation, not as validation, but as something quieter, something closer to alignment with what she had already known without needing to hear it spoken. Her eyes remained steady, her posture unchanged, but something inside her settled a little deeper, like a weight shifting into place rather than lifting away. Ethan held Blake's gaze for a moment longer, not pressing, not escalating, just allowing the admission to exist without interruption, the kind of silence that did not rush to move past truth once it arrived. The street around them remained calm, the distant hum of a passing car fading into the background as if the city itself had no need to interfere with what was unfolding on this small stretch of sidewalk. Officer Blake adjusted his stance again, a subtle shift, his shoulders straightening slightly, as if returning to something familiar, something structured, but the earlier certainty was gone, replaced by something more aware, more measured. "It has been corrected," he added, his tone controlled, but quieter now, as if each word carried more weight than before. Naomi's gaze softened just a fraction, not in acceptance, not in agreement, but in recognition of the attempt to define what had happened in a way that could be contained. She glanced briefly at Ethan, then back at Blake. "Correction does not erase it," she said, her voice calm, even, not sharp, just clear. The words landed without force, but they did not dissipate. They held their place in the air, the kind of truth that did not need to be raised to be heard. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, the muscles shifting under the streetlight, his eyes flickering for a brief moment before settling again. He did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more than any quick answer could have. Ethan shifted his weight subtly, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture still composed, still grounded. But now there was a quiet presence in the way he stood that filled the space without demanding it. "What matters now?" Ethan said after a moment, his voice steady, measured, "is whether it changes anything moving forward." The question did not challenge, did not accuse. It simply placed itself into the moment, asking for something beyond what had already been acknowledged. Blake looked at him, really looked this time, as if trying to understand the intent behind the words rather than just the words themselves. "I follow procedure," Blake replied, his tone returning to something more structured, but not as firm as before, "and I will continue to do so." Naomi listened, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. She took a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs, then released it just as evenly. "Procedure is only as good as the person applying it," she said quietly, the statement simple, but carrying a weight that settled into the space between them. Blake's gaze shifted again, this time not avoiding, but absorbing, as if the words required him to stand in them rather than step around them. The streetlight above flickered once more, then steadied, casting a soft, even glow across their faces. The light did not favor anyone. It simply illuminated what was already there. The silence returned again. But it was not the same silence as before. It was not tense, not expectant. It was something quieter, something that held what had been said without pressing for more. Naomi shifted her stance slightly, her body turning just enough toward Ethan, not leaving the moment, but preparing to move beyond it. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes meeting his in a quiet exchange that did not need words. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried understanding. She turned back to Blake for a final moment, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "Good night, officer," she said. The words simple, not dismissive, not warm, just complete. Blake inclined his head slightly, the movement restrained, controlled. "Ma'am," he replied, the title now carrying less distance than it had before, more recognition, less assumption. Ethan held Blake's gaze for a brief second longer, then nodded once as well, not as acknowledgement of authority, but as acknowledgement of the moment itself. The exchange complete, Naomi turned fully now, her steps steady as she moved down the sidewalk, Ethan falling into step beside her, not leading, not following, just present. Their pace matched without effort, the rhythm of their footsteps blending into the quiet hum of the night. Behind them, Blake remained where he stood for a moment longer, his posture still, his gaze following them as they walked away. The space they left behind not empty, but changed. The diner door remained closed now, the light inside steady, the world continuing as it always did. But something had shifted, something small but real, something that would not be undone by the passing of time. Naomi did not look back, did not slow, her focus forward, her breath steady, her presence unchanged, and beside her, Ethan walked in quiet alignment, the distance between them not measured in steps, but in understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be known. The distance between them and the diner grew with each step, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough that the glow of its windows softened behind them, blending into the rest of the streetlights that lined the block. Naomi walked with the same steady rhythm, her breath even, her shoulders relaxed, but there was a quiet shift in the way she held herself now, something less guarded, not because the night had been easy, but because it had been faced without bending. Ethan kept pace beside her, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze forward for a moment before turning slightly toward her, not interrupting her silence, just sharing it, the kind of silence that did not demand to be filled. After a few steps, he spoke, his voice low, even. "You should not have had to explain something that simple." The words were not sharp, not heated, just stated, like a fact that did not need emphasis. Naomi let out a quiet breath, not quite a sigh, just an exhale that carried a small release. "I know," she said, her voice soft, steady. She glanced at him briefly, then back ahead. "But sometimes simple things get complicated when someone decides they are." Ethan nodded once, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted, a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken out loud. They reached the crosswalk, the signal now blinking white, counting down from 12, then 11, the numbers steady. Indifferent to anything but time, Naomi stepped forward, her shoes tapping lightly against the painted lines, Ethan following beside her, the sound of their footsteps blending with the faint hum of the city. Halfway across, a car slowed at the intersection, its headlights washing over them briefly before dimming as it came to a stop, the driver watching for a second longer than necessary. Then looking away, the moment passing without acknowledgement, they reached the other side. The sidewalk stretching ahead in a quiet line, the night settling into something calmer now. Behind them, Officer Blake remained on the edge of the sidewalk, the space where he stood feeling different than it had minutes ago. He had not moved right away, had not turned back into the diner. Instead, he watched as Naomi and Ethan crossed the street, their figures moving together without urgency, without tension. And something about that stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have. He shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing along the edge of his belt again. A habit, a reflex, but this time it did not bring the same sense of control. Instead, it felt like something he was reaching for that no longer fit as easily as it once had. The words replayed in his mind, not loudly, not in a rush, but one at a time. It was clear. It just was not believed, and they did not fade the way he expected them to. They stayed, repeating in a quieter, steadier way. He glanced back toward the diner, the warm light inside now distant, ordinary again, the waitress moving behind the counter, the man at the stool returning to his meal, everything continuing as if the moment had been absorbed and set aside, but it had not been set aside for him, not entirely. He looked down at his hands, then back up toward the street, where Naomi and Ethan had already reached the far corner, their figures smaller now, but still visible under the streetlight. He took a step forward, then stopped, the movement incomplete, as if something inside him had not yet decided what direction to take, across the street. Naomi slowed slightly as they reached the next block, her steps easing into a quieter pace. The tension that had once sat just beneath her skin now fading into something less sharp, not gone, but no longer pressing. Ethan glanced at her. Again, his voice still calm. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, not pushing, not expecting, just offering the space. Naomi shook her head gently, her lips pressing together for a moment before she spoke. "There is not much to say," she replied, her tone even, but not closed, just settled. "It happened. It got handled. That is it." Ethan watched her for a second longer, then nodded, accepting the answer as it was given, not searching for more, not adding weight to something she had already carried through. They continued walking, the street quieter now, fewer cars passing, the sound of a distant train horn echoing faintly through the night. Naomi slipped her hands into the pockets of her jacket, her fingers brushing against the folded bill again, a small, familiar detail that grounded her. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air, then let it fade behind them. Officer Blake finally turned, his steps slower now as he moved back toward the diner door, the handle cool under his hand as he paused for just a second before pushing it open. The bell chimed softly again, the same sound as before, but it did not feel the same. Inside, the warmth returned, the light steady, the routine continuing, but as he stepped back in, something in his posture had changed, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not looking for it, but enough that the moment outside had not been left behind. It had followed him in, quiet, persistent, waiting, the kind of thing that did not demand attention but did not disappear either. And outside, Naomi and Ethan continued down the street, their steps even, their pace unbroken, the night stretching ahead, calm, steady, carrying them forward without needing to look back. Inside the diner, the door closed behind Officer Blake with a soft chime that sounded exactly the same as before, but felt different in a way he could not immediately name. The warmth of the room settling around him again, the smell of coffee and fried eggs lingering in the air, the quiet conversations resuming in low tones, yet none of it quite returning to what it had been, not entirely. He stood just inside the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, his hand still resting lightly against the door as if he had not fully decided whether he had come back in or simply paused on the threshold between two versions of the same place. The waitress glanced up from the counter, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping back to the surface she was wiping, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she was thinking about something. Beyond the task in front of her, the man at the counter did not look up this time, but his posture remained slightly shifted, less relaxed than before, as if the moment had settled somewhere he had not yet put down. Blake stepped forward finally, his boots making a faint sound against the tiled floor, each step measured, not rushed, his posture still structured but no longer carrying the same quiet certainty. He moved toward the counter, stopping at the edge where Naomi had been sitting earlier, his eyes flicking briefly to the empty spot, the chair now pushed in neatly, the coffee mug still resting there, a thin ring marking where it had sat, the details small, ordinary, but they held his attention longer than they should have. "You did the right thing," the waitress said after a moment, her voice low, not looking directly at him. The words simple, but they landed in a way that did not feel like agreement, more like an observation placed carefully between them. Blake did not respond immediately, his gaze still on the counter, his fingers brushing lightly along the edge of it as if grounding himself in something physical. "I followed procedure," he replied finally, his tone controlled, familiar, but it did not carry the same weight as before. The waitress paused, her hand stilling for just a second before she continued wiping the surface. Maybe, she said quietly, not arguing, not pushing, just letting the words sit there. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes lifting. Now, scanning the room as if looking for something that would settle the moment back into place. But everything looked the same. The booths, the lights, the quiet conversations. Nothing had changed on the surface, and yet something underneath had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He turned slightly, his gaze landing on the register, the drawer now closed, the numbers already reconciled. The simple confirmation that had undone everything he had assumed minutes earlier. Outside, Naomi and Ethan continued walking, the rhythm of their steps steady, the night stretching ahead of them in a quiet line of streetlights and distant sounds. Naomi slowed slightly as they reached the entrance to a small parking lot, her car sitting beneath a flickering light that buzzed faintly above it. She stopped near the driver's side door, her hand resting on the handle without opening it yet. Ethan stopped beside her, his posture relaxed, his gaze shifting briefly to her, then to the street behind them. Not checking, not concerned, just aware. Naomi let out a slow breath, the cool air catching in her chest before easing out again. "You did not have to say anything back there," she said after a moment. Her voice soft, not accusing, just reflective. Ethan shook his head slightly, a small motion. "I did not say anything you had not already said," he replied, his tone even. Naomi glanced at him, a faint shift in her expression, something that almost reached a smile but stopped just short of it. "You said it differently," she said, and that was enough. Not an explanation, not a conclusion, just a recognition of the way presence could change a moment without overpowering it. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "You handled it," he said, echoing her earlier words. But this time they carried a different weight. Not just acknowledgement, but something closer to respect. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly on the car door handle, then relaxed again. She looked up at the flickering light above them, its uneven glow casting shifting shadows across the pavement. "I should not have to," she said quietly, the words not heavy, not dramatic, just true. Ethan did not respond right away, his silence. Not empty, but full, holding the space for the truth of what she had said without trying to soften it or move past it too quickly. Inside the diner, Blake turned away from the counter, his steps carrying him toward the door again, but slower this time, more deliberate. He paused halfway, his gaze moving across the room one more time, as if seeing it differently now, not just as a place he entered and controlled, but as a place where something had unfolded beyond that control, something that had not needed volume or force to hold its ground. His hand moved to his pocket, pulling out a small notepad, the paper worn slightly at the edges. He flipped it open, his pen hovering over the page for a moment before he wrote a few lines, the motion quiet, almost hesitant, as if the act itself required a different kind of attention than usual. He closed it again, slipping it back into his pocket, the movement small, but deliberate. Outside, Naomi finally opened the car door, the soft click breaking the quiet for just a second. She paused before getting in, her hand still resting on the edge, her gaze shifting once more down the street, not looking back at the diner, not needing to, just taking. In the space ahead, Ethan remained beside her, his presence steady, not moving until she did, and in that moment, the night held them both, not as something that needed to be resolved, but as something that had been faced and carried forward, unchanged in its truth, but no longer unspoken. Naomi remained still for a moment beside the open car door, her hand resting lightly against the frame, the faint hum of the flickering overhead light filling the quiet space above them, the uneven glow shifting across her face in soft intervals, not enough to distract, just enough to remind her that even steady things could falter without fully going out. She drew in a slow breath, the cool air settling into her chest before easing out again, and then she turned slightly toward Ethan, her eyes meeting his with a quiet clarity that had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. "I am not angry," she said, her voice low, steady, and it was not defensive, not corrective, just a truth she felt the need to place between them before anything else could take shape. Ethan held her gaze, his expression calm, attentive, the kind of attention that did not interrupt or rush ahead. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just the words but the space they came from. I know, he replied, his tone even. Naomi's fingers shifted slightly against the car door, her grip loosening just a fraction. She glanced down for a moment, then back up. But I am tired, she added, and this time there was a weight in the words, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present in a way that did not need elaboration. Ethan's eyes softened slightly, not with pity, not with concern that reached too far, but with understanding that stayed where it was needed. He stepped a little closer, not closing the space completely, just enough that his presence felt more grounded beside her. You are allowed to be, he said. The words simple, but they did not try to fix anything. They just made room for it to exist. Naomi let out a quiet breath, her shoulders easing slightly, as if something small had been set down, not gone, but no longer carried in the same way. She looked past him briefly, toward the street, the quiet line of lights stretching into the distance, each one steady in its place, and then she spoke again. It is not the moment itself, she said, her voice still calm, still measured. It is how easy it was for it to happen. Ethan did not respond immediately, his silence holding the space for what she had said without trying to soften it or redirect it. He nodded once more, a small acknowledgement that did not dilute the truth of her words. And how often it probably does, he added quietly, not as an assumption, but as a recognition. Naomi met his gaze again, and this time there was a faint shift in her expression, something that settled deeper, something that did not need to be named. She nodded once, the movement small but certain. Yes, she said, and that was enough. The word did not expand, did not require explanation. It simply existed, complete on its own, inside the diner. Officer Blake stood near the door again, his hand resting loosely at his side, the small notepad still tucked into his pocket, the lines he had written not visible but not forgotten. He glanced toward the counter where the waitress continued her work, her movements steady now, the earlier hesitation replaced by something more grounded. He looked at the empty booth where Naomi had sat, the coffee mug still there, untouched, the ring on the table fading slowly as the surface dried, the details small, ordinary, but they held his attention in a way they had not before. He reached for the mug, his fingers brushing lightly against the ceramic, then stopping, not lifting it, just acknowledging its presence before letting his hand fall back to his side. The room continued around him, the low murmur of conversation, the clink of dishes, the steady rhythm of a place returning to its routine. But for him, something remained unsettled, not in a loud or dramatic way, just in a quiet, persistent way that did not fade as quickly as everything else. Outside, Naomi finally shifted her weight forward, her hand releasing the car door as she stepped back slightly, not getting in yet, just creating space between herself and the moment she had paused in. Ethan watched her, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. She reached up briefly, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, the motion small, habitual, grounding. Then she looked at him again. "Thank you," she said, and the words were not heavy, not formal. They were simple, but they carried a quiet sincerity that did not need anything added to them. Ethan inclined his head slightly, the gesture small, understated. "You did not need me," he replied, his tone even. Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that held both acknowledgement and difference. "Maybe not," she said, "but I am glad you were there." The statement settled between them, not as dependence, not as necessity, but as something real, something that existed without diminishing what she had already done on her own. Ethan nodded once more, the understanding clear, the respect unchanged. The flickering light above them buzzed again, then steadied, casting a more even glow across the parking lot, the shadows softening, the edges less sharp. Naomi glanced up at it for a brief second, then back at him. "I am going home," she said, not as an announcement, not as a conclusion, just as the next step. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving her space. "I will follow," he said, his voice calm, not insistent, just present. Naomi nodded once, her hand returning to the car door, this time opening it fully, the soft sound of the hinge breaking the quiet for just a second. She paused before getting in, her gaze lifting once more toward the street ahead, the line of lights steady, the night open, and then she stepped inside, the door closing gently behind her, the sound soft, final in a way that did not carry weight, just movement. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the car, not out of concern, not out of control, just out of presence. And inside the diner, Officer Blake turned away from the empty booth, his steps slower now as he moved back toward the counter. The small details of the night settling into something that would not be easily dismissed, not because they demanded attention, but because they had been seen, and once seen, they did not disappear. The car engine started with a soft turn, a low hum that settled into the quiet of the parking lot without disturbing it. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present, the dashboard lights casting a gentle glow across her fingers, steady, unshaken. She did not move right away, her gaze lifting through the windshield toward the street ahead, the line of lights stretching forward, each one constant, each one holding its place without question. She exhaled slowly, the breath visible for a moment against the cool glass before fading. Outside, Ethan stepped back another half step, giving her space not just physically but in the moment itself, his hands resting at his sides, his posture calm, grounded. He watched as she sat there for a second longer, not waiting for her to leave, just present in the space until she chose to move. The faint buzz of the overhead lights steadied completely now, no longer flickering, its glow even, consistent. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers brushing the edge of the steering wheel before settling again, and then, without hesitation, she eased the car forward, the tires rolling softly over the pavement, the motion smooth, unforced, as she turned onto the street, her headlights cutting a quiet path ahead, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward. Ethan watched until the car reached the corner, until the red glow of the brake lights paused briefly at the stop sign, then disappeared as she continued down the road, the night absorbing her into its steady rhythm. He stood there for a moment longer, the space she left behind not empty, but complete, as if the moment had reached its natural end without needing anything more. Inside the diner, Officer Blake stood near the counter, his gaze resting once more on the empty booth, the coffee mug now gone, the table wiped clean, no trace of what had happened visible to anyone who had not been there. And yet he could still see it, not as an image, not as a replay, but as something quieter, something that stayed in the way the room felt different even when it looked the same. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out the small notepad, flipping it open to the lines he had written earlier, his eyes scanning them slowly, as if reading them again might change something about how they felt. But they did not. They stayed as they were, simple, direct, and heavier than they appeared. He closed the notepad, his fingers resting against it for a moment before sliding it back into his pocket, the motion deliberate, not dismissive, just contained. The waitress moved behind the counter, her step steady, her focus returning to the routine of the night, but her movements carried a quiet awareness now, something that had not been there before. The man at the counter finished his meal, placing his fork down gently, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door before he stood, leaving a few bills on the counter. The small actions of the night continuing, unchanged on the surface, but not untouched. Outside, Naomi drove through the quiet streets, the city stretching around her in soft lights and distant sounds, her hands steady on the wheel, her breath even. The earlier moment no longer pressing against her, not gone, but settled, placed where it belonged, not carried forward with weight, but acknowledged as part of the path she had already walked. She stopped at another light, the red glow reflecting across the hood of the car. She glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, not searching, not expecting, just a habit. The empty road behind her stretching back into the distance, clear, uninterrupted. She turned her gaze forward again as the light shifted to green, the motion smooth as she continued, the road opening ahead, steady, consistent. Inside the diner, Officer Blake finally turned away from the counter, his steps slower now as he moved toward the door once more. He paused with his hand on the handle, not hesitating, just acknowledging the moment before moving through it. He stepped outside, the night air cooler than before, the quiet settling around him. He looked down the street where Naomi's car had disappeared, the distance already too far to see anything but the steady line of lights. He stood there for a moment, not long, just enough to let the stillness settle. Then he exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the air before fading. And in that quiet, there was no announcement, no resolution spoken out loud, just a small shift, something internal, something that did not erase what had happened, but did not ignore it either, something that might change the next moment, or might not. But it existed now, undeniable, and inside the car, Naomi continued forward, her eyes steady, her hands calm, the night unfolding ahead of her without resistance, without question, just movement, just quiet, just the simple truth of continuing on, unchanged in who she was, but no longer unseen in the way she stood.